The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $55, and somewhere near the back of the crowd a man laughed loud enough to turn heads. It was the 12th of April, 1986, at the old Halloran estate sale on the north edge of Redfield, Iowa, and the wind that morning came in off the fields cold and thin, the kind of wind that goes through a canvas jacket and finds the bones underneath. 100 or so folks stood in the gravel lot behind the vacant drugstore, hands in pockets, breath white, waiting on the last of the odd lots. There had been the good furniture first, and the tools, and the porcelain from the upstairs apartment. And then, at the very end, when the crowd had started to thin, the auctioneer's boy wheeled out the cabinet. It was an ugly thing to look at. A tall oak pharmacist's cabinet, near 7 feet in height, with dozens of little drawers set into its face, and 2 larger cupboards at the base, each fitted with an old brass lock that had gone green. The wood was dark, water-stained along one side, and a long crack ran from the top corner down through the grain like a scar. The drawers were labeled in a faded script no one could read any more, some in Latin, some in an old druggist's shorthand that had died with the men who wrote it. Every drawer was locked, every one. And the keys, the auctioneer said plainly, had been lost for 40 years. Nobody bid. The auctioneer started at 20 and got nothing. He came down to 10. He came down to 5. And then a quiet hand went up near the front, and the price walked itself back up to 55, and the gavel came down, and the man at the back laughed. His name was Delmar Rooney, and he owned 3 car lots between Redfield and Des Moines. He was 49 years old that spring, heavy through the shoulders and the belly, clean-shaven, with a ruddy jowl that shone when he grinned, and he grinned often. He wore a bright green sport coat that day over a company polo, and a gold ring on his little finger. And he had come to the auction the way he came to most things in the county, which was to be seen. His Cadillac sat gleaming at the edge of the lot, washed that morning, and near it stood his old high school classmate, the man who had just bought the cabinet. That man was Everett Doss. He was 68 years old, lean as a fence post, stooped a little at the shoulders from a lifetime bent over benches and pin tumblers. His face was deeply lined and browned by weather, and under his work cap his hair was white and cropped close. He wore a chambray shirt buttoned to the throat, a canvas jacket gone soft to the elbows, and boots that had been resoled twice. His hands, when he lifted them from his pockets to sign the ticket, were the hands of a man who had worked with small metal all his life, knuckles thickened, fingernails clipped short and clean, a thin white scar running across the back of the right thumb. Everett had been the town locksmith for 41 years. He was, so far as anyone in Redfield knew, the last one. Delmar came across the gravel with his hands spread wide and that grin on his face. He said, loud enough for the thinning crowd to hear him, that Everett had just bought himself the finest draw wall in the county. He said it like a man delivering a punchline he had been saving. Somebody chuckled. Somebody else looked away. Everett folded his ticket and put it in his shirt pocket and did not answer. Delmar was not finished. He walked a slow circle around the cabinet and rapped his knuckles on the side of it and asked, in a voice pitched for the audience, what a man was going to do with 60 locked drawers and no keys. He asked whether Everett planned to open them with a prayer or with dynamite. He said the whole thing was a wall, that was all, just a wall made out of drawers, and it would look real fine in a barn somewhere holding nothing but mice. and that name stuck. By the end of the afternoon, half the men left in the lot were calling it the drawer wall, and Delmar Rooney was laughing every time somebody said it. What none of them saw, and what Everett had seen from across 20 feet of gravel, was the small brass plate set into the upper left corner of the cabinet, so tarnished it looked at first like a knot in the wood. The plate carried an engraved name, and under that name, faint but readable if you knew what you were looking at, a date. Everett had leaned in close during the preview hour and read the name and read the date, and had stood back and let his eyes travel over the whole cabinet slowly, the way a man reads a face he has not seen in many years. Then he had gone and stood at the front and waited for the gavel. The name on the plate was Ansel Halloran, druggist, and the date was 1943. Everett had learned his trade from a man named Julius Weir, who had kept a shop on 2nd Street in Council Bluffs from before the war until the year he died. Julius had been a small, patient man with round glasses and a habit of humming while he worked, and he had taught Everett most of what a locksmith needs to know, which is not what the books say. Julius used to tell him that a lock was only ever the shape of one man's caution, and that if you listened to it long enough, it would tell you what the man had been afraid of losing. He said a good locksmith did not force a lock. He said a good locksmith waited on it the way a farmer waits on rain. He said every keyway was a language, and every wafer and pin was a letter in that language, and a man who could read them could read anything a mortal hand had made to be closed. Everett had believed him then, and he believed him still. And if you had ever watched a quiet, capable person do slow work with steady hands while the world hurried past him and mocked him for being slow, you already understood the kind of man Everett Doss was and the kind of story this was going to be. He drove home in his 1971 Ford, the cabinet strapped upright in the bed with old moving blankets folded around its corners, and he took the county road slowly because the load was heavy and the wind was pushing sideways. Behind him, back at the auction lot, Delmar Rooney had made his last joke of the day and climbed into his Cadillac and driven off toward Des Moines. Everett did not look in the rear view. He had never much cared what men like Delmar did with their afternoons. There is a kind of patience that looks like weakness right up until the moment it doesn't, and Everett had carried that patience for so long, he no longer noticed the weight of it. He backed the truck up to the wide door of his shop, which stood behind his house on a half-acre at the edge of town, and with the help of his neighbor's boy, a quiet 17-year-old named Wyatt Coombs, who came over after school most days to sweep and to watch and to ask questions, he walked the cabinet down a plank ramp and stood it upright on the concrete floor. Wyatt ran a hand along the crack in the side and asked, softly, what was inside it. Everett said he did not know yet. Wyatt asked how long it would take to find out. Everett looked at the 60 small drawers and the 2 larger doors and the green brass of the locks, and he said it would take as long as it took. By that evening, the story had already started to move through Redfield. It moved the way stories move in small towns, which is through the diner first, and the feed store second, and the barber shop last. By Monday morning at the corner cafe, Delmar's name for the cabinet had become gospel. The drawer wall, they said. Old Everett paid $55 for a drawer wall. What was he going to do? Keep his socks in it? 60 pairs of socks, one for every drawer. A man at the counter said he had heard Everett was losing his mind, and another man said no. Everett had always been like that. Quiet men got stranger as they aged. Ray Pletcher, who had known Everett since the second grade and who ran the hardware store on Main, sat with his coffee and listened and said nothing until somebody asked him directly. And then Ray said only that if Everett Doss had bought it, Everett Doss had a reason. That did not stop the jokes. It never does. On Wednesday, Ray came out to the shop on his lunch hour and stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets and watched Everett work for a long time before he spoke. Then he said, gently, that folks were talking. Everett was seated on a low stool in front of the cabinet, a jeweler's loop pushed up on his forehead, a set of picks laid out on a strip of felt beside him like surgical tools. He said he knew folks were talking. Ray said, still gentle, that Delmar was talking loudest of all, that he had told half the county Everett had lost his marbles, and did Everett want him to say anything? He said, without looking up, that it would open. Ray stood there a moment longer, and then he nodded the small nod of a man who has known another man long enough to trust him without needing the reason, and he went back to his store. Everett did not answer the town, because the town was not what he was listening to. He was listening to the cabinet. The story of Ansel Halloran was one that most people. He had come to town in 1919, a young pharmacist from Dubuque, and had opened his drugstore on the north end of Main Street, in a narrow brick building he bought outright with money his father had left him. For 24 years he ran that store, and by every account of the older folks who remembered him, he had been a decent man, careful with his measures, generous with credit during the lean years of the 30s, a quiet churchgoer, unmarried, living in the small apartment above the shop. He had been known to fill prescriptions for farm families who could not pay and to write nothing in the ledger about it. He had been the sort of man who was easy to overlook because he never asked to be seen. In the fall of 1943, with the war on and half the young men of the county overseas, a rumor started that Ansel Halloran had been selling morphine and other controlled substances out the back door of his shop, to whom nobody could quite say. But the rumor had a life of its own, the way rumors do in a small place during a hard year. A federal inspector came through in November. 2 weeks later, an audit was opened. And on the morning of the 3rd of December, 1943, Ansel Halloran was found dead in the apartment above his store, a bottle of his own compounding on the nightstand, and a short note on the desk that said only that he was sorry. The audit was closed without a finding. The shop was locked up. The apartment was cleared out by a distant cousin who took the cat and left the furniture. And the story that settled over the town, the story that stayed there for 43 years, was that Ansel Halloran had killed himself because he had been caught. He had not been caught. There had been nothing to catch. But a man who dies with a rumor around his neck wears that rumor for a long time after. And Ansel Halloran had worn his all the way to 1986, when his cabinet came out into the gravel behind his old shop, and nobody wanted it. Everett had been 25 years old in 1943. He remembered Ansel Halloran. He remembered him well. Ansel had filled a prescription for Everett's mother in the last year of her life and had refused 3 times. Everett had not forgotten that, and he had never quite believed the story the town had settled on. And when he had seen the name on the brass plate at the auction, he had felt something old and slow turn over inside him, the way a stone turns over when the ground beneath it finally softens. He worked on the cabinet for 11 nights. He began with the 2 lower cupboards, because the locks there were the largest and the oldest, and would tell him the most about the hand that had made them. They were mortise locks, of a type he had not seen in perhaps 30 years, brass-cased, with warded bits inside the bolt-work and a small secondary lever that a factory locksmith would have missed. He did not drill. He did not pry. He sat on his stool with the loop down over his eye and the pick held light between his fingers, and he listened. And after 2 evenings, the first cupboard opened with a soft click that made Wyatt, watching from the doorway, let out a breath he had not known he was holding. The second cupboard took another evening. Inside both were only papers, ledgers, and a small tin box. And Everett did not open the box yet. He set it aside and turned to the drawers. There were 60 of them, arranged in 6 rows of 10, and each had a small brass pull and a keyway no larger than a pencil eraser. The locks were cam locks of a common druggist's pattern, not difficult in themselves, but Ansel Halloran, or someone working for him, had modified them. Every third drawer had been fitted with a secondary pin that would break the pick if it were forced. Everett found the first broken pick on the 3rd night and understood at once, and after that he worked more slowly, testing each drawer with a wire before he committed a tool to it. Wyatt watched and asked, and Everett explained, and the boy learned in those 11 nights more about the trade than he had learned in the year before. Julius Weir would have liked him. On the 9th night Everett opened the last drawer, and on the 10th night he sat and looked at what he had found without touching any of it, and on the 11th night he opened the tin box from the lower cupboard. The drawers had held mostly what drawers in a druggist's cabinet hold: powders in labeled envelopes, dried and useless now, small glass bottles with stoppers, little cards of pills gone chalk-white with time. But 3 drawers, spaced apart in the middle rows, had held something else. One had held a bundle of letters tied in brown string. One had held a leather ledger with a red cloth marker. And one, the smallest at the very center of the cabinet, had held a stack of United States currency, older bills bound in a paper band, that Everett counted twice and found to total 4,000. The tin box from the cupboard held the last thing. It held a single envelope sealed with wax, addressed in a careful hand to whoever opened this. And inside the envelope was a letter, 4 pages long, written in the same careful hand, dated the 1st of December, 1943, 2 days before Ansel Halloran. Everett read the letter through once by the yellow light of the shop lamp, and then he folded it and set it down. And then he sat for a long time with his hands flat on the workbench and did not move. The letter said, in the plain words of a plain man, that Ansel Halloran had not sold anything out the back door of his shop. It said that the federal inspector, who had come through in November of 1943, had been taking money from a supplier in Cedar Rapids to open false audits on small-town druggists, and that Ansel had refused to pay, and that the audit against him. It said that Ansel had gathered proof, and that the proof was in the ledger in the middle drawer, with names and dates and amounts, and that the letters in the other drawer were from 2 other druggists in the state to whom the same thing had been done. It said that the money in the small drawer was money Ansel had set aside from his own savings to be given to the family of a young man from Redfield, a soldier named Thomas Buckhalter, who had died in the Pacific that autumn, and whose widow Ansel had learned. It said that if Ansel was found dead in the coming days, it would not be by his own hand, though it would be made to look that way, and that he was writing this letter because he had been threatened and did not think he had long. It asked, at the end, in a single line, that whoever found the letter would please see that the truth was known, and that the money reached the Buchalter family, and that his name, when it was spoken in Redfield again, would be spoken clean. Everett read the letter a second time. Then he closed the tin box and turned off the shop lamp and walked back to his house through the cold spring dark, and slept badly, and rose before dawn. He was 68 years old, and he lived alone, and the $4,280 would have carried him through more than one hard winter. The ledger and the letters were 43 years old, and the men named in them were most of them dead, and no one in Redfield would ever have known what had been in the cabinet, because no one in Redfield had believed there was anything in the cabinet. He could have burned the letter. He could have spent the money. He could have set the cabinet in a corner of the shop and called it a drawer wall himself and let Delmar Rooney be right, and no one would ever have known. He did not think about it for very long. In the morning, he drove first to the county courthouse in Adel and asked to see the county attorney, a woman named Frances Kettering. And he laid the letter and the ledger and a bundle of other druggist's letters on her desk and told her, in as few words as the thing could be told in, what he had found. She read the letter through with her hand at her mouth, and then she read it again, and then she picked up her telephone. Everett left the papers with her and drove back to Redfield. He drove next to a small farmhouse 3 miles south of town, where a woman named Alma Buchalter lived alone. She was 71 years old that spring, the widow of the soldier Thomas Buchalter, and she had never remarried, and she lived on a small pension and the vegetables she grew herself. Everett had known her a little, the way people in small towns know each other a little, and she opened the door to him without surprise, and made him coffee, and sat across from him at her kitchen table. He put the paper-banded stack of bills on the table between them, and told her where it had come from and why it had been set aside, and he read her the paragraph of the letter that named her husband Alma Buchalter did not cry. She put her hand flat on top of the money as if to make sure it was real, and she sat quiet for a long minute, and then she said only that she had always wondered why Ansel Halloran had come by the house that November of 1943 to ask after her. Everett said he thought she knew why. Now she nodded, and then the tears came, quiet ones. The kind old women cry when a debt they had stopped expecting to be paid. Everett finished his coffee and set the cup in the sink and left before she could thank him properly. The rest moved quickly, the way these things do when the paper is in order and the names are named. Frances Kettering took the ledger to the state, and the state took it to the federal government, and within 2 months the inspector from 1943, who was still alive in a nursing home in Illinois, had been publicly named, and the 2 other druggists in the ledger, both dead by then, had been publicly cleared. Which had been the wrong story for 43 years was finally the right one. The Redfield paper ran it on the front page for 3 weeks running. The Des Moines paper picked it up. A small historical marker was placed on the brick front of the old drugstore, and inside the county museum, in a room they cleaned out for the purpose. The Pharmacist cabinet was set upright against a wall with a plaque beside it that told, in careful print, the true story of the man who had built it. Delmar Rooney said very little in those months. He was seen once at the corner cafe, sitting alone, and folks noticed he did not laugh the way he used to. Within 2 years, his largest car lot had gone under, and within 3 he had sold the other 2 and moved his family down to Florida, where a man could start over among strangers. Nobody expected him to. Everett Doss did not go either, not on the day of the opening. He went a week later, on a Tuesday evening near closing time, in his canvas jacket and his work cap, and he stood in the doorway of the small room and looked at the cabinet from 20 feet away, the way he had first looked at it in the gravel lot. The drawers were closed again, all 60 of them, and the 2 cupboards below, and someone had polished the brass so that the little plate in the upper left corner caught the light. He did not go closer. He stood a minute, and then another, and then he touched the brim of his cap once, the small gesture a man makes to another man across a distance, and he turned and walked out to his truck and drove home. He went back to his shop that night and swept the floor and put his picks away in their felt roll and hung his jacket on the peg by the door. Wyatt came by the next afternoon with a lock he had been trying to open for a week, and Everett sat down beside him on the low stool and showed him, patiently, what he had been missing. That was the whole of it. That was the shape of the man's life before the cabinet and after. So I'll leave it with you. If you had been the one to sit down at that workbench and read that letter by the yellow light of a shop lamp, with no one in the world knowing what you had found and no one ever likely to know, would you have folded the money into your coat and turned off the light and gone home, or would you have done what Everett Doss did